Continuing our reading in The World and Thorinn by Damon Knight. Today is Chapter 3, Section 6. One of the children, a half-grown girl, stood by the pod vines and waited for Thorinn. She gestured toward one of the pods and said something. There was a questioning note in her voice, and she stared earnestly into his eyes. Thorinn looked at the pod, which still hung heavy to the ground. All the others were open and empty except one or two, further back in the tangle, and they looked brown and old. One had fallen from its brittle stalk and lay dark on the ground. The broad-leafed vines had crawled over it, almost hiding it from view. Thorinn turned to the pod again, thinking of the boy. "Is he still inside?" he asked. She looked at him blankly. He made a pushing motion, then touched his sword, gesturing toward the pod. After a moment, she seemed to understand. She repeated his gestures, then asked him something else in her piping voice. Thorinn looked around. The people were drifting away upriver. These two were the last ones left. "Isn't he coming out?" Thorinn asked. He crouched and laid his hand beside his face, closed his eyes as if in sleep. He straightened, pointed to the pod again. The girl looked puzzled but repeated his gestures. She came closer, looking into his face, and said something twice over with great earnestness. Surely he could make her understand. Thorinn crouched again, imitating the boy asleep in the pod, then mimed coming awake, the pod opening and the boy stepping out. The girl stared at him. She spoke in a falling cadence. Her eyes and mouth were sad. With one hand she made a gesture Thorinn did not understand. They looked at each other for a moment. Then the girl turned away to follow the others, who were already distant down the long strip of green. The pod hung motionless on the vine. Thorinn prodded it with his foot experimentally, moved it a hand's breadth, but there was no answering movement within. He considered whether he should cut the pod open. Did she mean the boy was never going to come out? Moving listlessly, she was nevertheless slowly catching up to the others. Thorinn hesitated a moment, then decided to leave well enough alone and followed her. Scattered along the grassy bank, the people drifted away before him in twos and threes. The children and the twigmen, for the most part, had gone on ahead. The old people, the women and the women's men, strolled behind. Their voices were muted and gentle. In a few paces, Thorinn had caught up with the girl. He slowed down to keep pace with her, but although she glanced at him once, she did not speak, and after a moment, losing patience, Thorinn went on ahead. Where the long green meadow narrowed, the people were filing into an opening in the forest. He could glimpse their bright petal bobbing between the trees. The trail wound gently upward, never steep or difficult, between shrubs with unblemished bright leaves, flowers, vines, trees with hanging clusters of fruit. Here and there it curved to avoid a fallen tree. The ground was softly carpeted everywhere. The bushes had no thorns. Thorinn slipped past the ambling women and old people, where he could do so without rudeness on the narrow trail, and eventually had passed all but the twigmen and the children, who were now out of sight. The trail was still plain, and he followed it for half a league until it emerged in a wide green meadow, which at first appeared sickle-shaped, curving away from him. Then, blinking in the late skylight, he saw it, in fact, it formed a ring around a clump of slender trees. People were moving at random around the bases of these trees, where Thorinn saw a huddle of curious round structures of withy and vines. Up in the branches, a flash of movement caught his eye, and he saw platforms there with people on them. As he approached, he found that some of the bulbous structures around the trees were little bowers. What he had taken for withies were simply the stalks of plants that had been bent together and secured with interlaced vines that still bore their leaves and blossoms. Children were squatting in a few of these. Other huts, somewhat larger, were covered almost to the ground by a solid green skin, which, on examination, he found to be composed of broad leaves overlapped and somehow sealed together tightly at their edges. Peering into the doorway of one of these, he saw heaped flowers and a few gourds, otherwise it was empty. Voices piped behind him. The rest of the people were emerging from the trees. They crossed to the meadow, a few glancing at him but making no sign. They gathered around the base of the trees in little groups. A few disappeared into the green huts or climbed into the platforms above, then a few more. Thornton, who had waited in vain for any invitation to follow them, withdrew a little and watched. Now only two of the people remained, a woman and her little man. Arm in arm, they entered one of the green huts. The birds in the treetops had fallen silent. Thornton looked up. Silent and swift, an edge of darkness was sweeping across the sky. It was not high-arched like the sky scythe of Hovenskar, but straight as a string. In 2 heartbeats it had passed, and the sky was dark. Kneeling in the darkness, feeling the cool breeze that presently began to whisper across the meadow, Thornton began to suspect that he was further from home than he had reckoned. That's the end of chapter 3.